The reading this morning is taken from Esther chapter 4, verses 5 to 17. Then Esther summoned Hatach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hatach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for this annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence, to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hatach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I will perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions.
Thank you, Andrea, for reading that for us. And I want to thank you all so much for your support for me over the last few years. It's been really good to know that there have been people here around the UK, but here in King's Lynn, who've been praying for our work. And a special thanks to Lee also for keeping you informed and letting you know about what's going on in BMS. As you know, I'm been a mission worker with BMS, but in Nepal I work for an organization called Kiski Quip. And I don't know if you get the BMS magazine, Engage. If you do, it's a free magazine. You will know that this month, actually, there's an article about our work and photos of me in it. So if you don't get it, there's some copies at the back, and you're very welcome to take one. And also, if you want to sign up, you'll get it sent to you every 2 months, I think it is, or every month. It's a really good magazine with lots of information, so help yourselves if you don't. Can we have the next one? The verses that were read to us, I want to focus on this one. And who knows that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. As I was getting ready to return to Nepal in 2015 as a volunteer, you might remember that there was a large earthquake in Nepal at that time, and it had caused a lot of destruction and devastation around the country. And lots of my teacher colleagues and some friends said, "Joy, you shouldn't go now. It'll be too dangerous. And also, they won't want you there now because they're just busy trying to rebuild their lives after the earthquake." And so many people said that to me that I began to question whether I should go and to doubt my calling. And this verse was really a good confirmation for me that I should go, that it was the right time. I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do there or why I was going to go at this specific time, but this verse really confirmed that it was right to go. And I think this is not just a motivational verse for Christians, is it? But it's a reminder of how God puts us in certain situations and positions at certain times for his purposes. Because you know that God isn't mentioned at all in the book of Esther, but it's very clear that there's evidence of God's divine purpose for Esther being there. And she was not there by accident. Not only was she in the right place at the right time, but she was already prepared for what she had to do. She'd been brought up as a good Jew by Mordecai. She knew her responsibilities to her people. She'd been chosen by the king to be queen. So she was actually the only person who could help to save her people. I'm retiring from BMS now after 14 years of service, and I suppose at that kind of time in your life, it's a time of reflection over the last few years that I've been with BMS in Nepal. And in all of it, I can see how God has prepared me and then placed me in situations at just the right time, even if I didn't always know it at the time or it was really difficult at the time. Next, Katie. In 1989, I went to Nepal first with the BMS, and I was going to teach the children of missionaries with the United Mission to Nepal. And in those days, it was quite common for missionaries to arrive in Nepal and not to know exactly where they were going to be working. And that happened with me. I started language study in Kathmandu, and then I was asked to go to Okhaldunga for a week's orientation. Okhaldunga is in the east of Nepal. It's a lovely name, isn't it? It's almost Scottish sounding, Okhaldunga. I didn't know where it was to begin with, but anyway, I made my way there. And I remember crying a lot that week. Okhaldunga was such a difficult place to live. The journey was really hard. I managed to get a flight on one of the 2 planes that week, but even after I got off the plane, it was 5 or 6 hours walk up very steep hills. And I knew if I didn't get a plane, it would be 5 days walk to the nearest road. So it seemed so remote. And I was going to be the only single person. There were some other mission workers there, but I was going to be the only single person in the project. There wasn't a schoolroom. I would have to organize a room to be built before I could start teaching. Relationships in the team were quite difficult. It happens, doesn't it, even in Christian circles sometimes. People don't get on as well as we should. There were very few local Christians in the church. The hospital had been destroyed by an earthquake. It seems I kind of follow earthquakes, so I hope you're okay here in King's Lynn. The local Rai people distrusted the foreigners, and the pastor of the church was in jail. He hadn't done anything bad. He was preaching the gospel, and he was imprisoned. But as a timid 30-year-old, it seemed too much. And I decided that when I went back to Kathmandu, I would ask for a different placement. And as expected, when I got back the next week, I was called in to the education director's office, and he said something like, "I know Okhaldunga is not an easy place to live and work, but are you willing to go and teach the children of missionaries there?" And I opened my mouth and I heard myself say, "Yes, I'll go." It wasn't what I was supposed to say, but I went. Next picture, please. I scraped the archives to find this embarrassing photo. I think it was 1992 with some of the children that I taught in Nepal. And of course, I settled into life in Okhaldunga, and I came to love the place and to love the people. I got my walking legs, and I came to understand the local culture. There were very few people in Okhaldunga, in the village, who spoke English. And so very quickly, I learnt more Nepali. My few phrases that I'd picked up in language school soon grew, and I became much more confident at speaking the language. And as well as teaching the children of missionaries, I also was able to teach in a local Nepali school. And I learnt how the school system works and about the curriculum in Nepal. I even had the opportunity to help to set up a school for the hospital staff and the local village children where we lived. I appointed and trained the first teachers and helped to set up the classrooms and organize resources. And little did I know that I would be doing exactly that a few years later when I started work with Kiski-Quip in my latest role as a teacher trainer. But God was using the time in Okhaldunga, even though it was so difficult, to prepare me for the rest of my time in Nepal. In the 1990s, Christians were being widely persecuted, and so we had to be very careful what we said and what we did. And sometimes that was really frustrating, not to be able to share our faith openly with others. And we heard that in other places the church was growing, but in Okhaldunga it wasn't growing at all. The Christians, the church met in a very small room hidden in the compound, in the hospital compound, because we were so afraid of persecution. And in spite of our prayers, in spite of our desire for the church to grow, we didn't see that happen. And I had great expectations of what I would achieve in Nepal. I'd been sent by BMS, I'd been commissioned by my local church in Scotland. I was supported by faithful praying people like yourselves around the country. What was I doing in Okhaldunga if God's kingdom wasn't growing? Why was I there? And I remember praying and sharing that with one of my friends, one of my colleagues, and as we prayed, it became very clear to me that God was saying that he'd taken me to Okhaldunga not so much for what I could do for him, but for what he wanted to do in my life. And sometimes that's the same for all of us, isn't it? We have great aims and great expectations and plans of what we want to do for God in the church, in the community, meeting the needs of people. And that is great. That is part of our discipleship, part of our life as a Christian. But often in the joys and the challenges of those things, God works in our life to bring us more closer to him, to bring us to be the people that he wants us to be. And so I felt that God had taken me to Okhaldunga to prepare me to be a better servant of his and to prepare me for what was to come. Next picture, please. A few years ago, I had the privilege of returning to Okhaldunga. And it was great to see that there's now a new hospital, those big red buildings at the bottom right, with lots of solar panels on the roof, a really great provision of health service in that area. And that the school was still providing a good education. You can see it on the top left, the long yellow building with lots of windows. And that was great to see. But the biggest change and the most exciting was in the church. Now the believers meet twice a week, on a Saturday and a Sunday, because there are too many people to meet once a week. And they don't meet in the hospital, they meet on top of the hill where everybody can see the church building. So that was a huge change. And I asked what had happened to make the church grow, because it was after I'd left and after most of my colleagues had left that God began to work in the lives of people there. There had been a man in the hospital who worked in the hospital who was a very anti-Christian guy. And if ever anybody wanted to come to church or showed an interest in believing in Jesus, he would persecute them. He would say, if you do that, we won't come and help you in your fields at harvest time, and you won't be able to have water from the tap because you'll pollute it, and it will be really difficult for you to live here. And so even if people were interested, it was very difficult for them to openly express their faith. His son went to our school and had a good education, and when he grew older, he went to work in the Middle East. And while he was there, he met a Nepali believer who shared the gospel with him, and he came to faith. And so when he came back to Nepal, he went in trepidation, really, to see his father back in Okhaldunga. And as expected, his father said, "If you believe that foreign religion, I want nothing more to do with you. You are not my son. Don't ever come here." And so he went back to Kathmandu and went to study in Bible college and trained to be a pastor. He met a lovely Christian lady and married her, became husband and wife. But he didn't give up on his family. He went to visit whenever he could, and when the buffalo got sick, he went and prayed for the buffalo, and the buffalo got better. And slowly, his father came to see that there was maybe something in this Christian faith, and that there was a big change in his son, and he realized it was for the better. And he came to faith too. What a miracle. And when we were there, we went to the church, and we were invited that afternoon to go down to the river for a baptism. When we'd lived there, there'd been very few baptisms, but even if there were, we were asked not to come because it was too dangerous. But we were invited to go openly to the river, and the whole church went. They put stones to dam the river to make a pool, and there were 12 people being baptized. And the first person to be baptized was Mighty's mother, the last person in that family to come to faith. And so now the son of that anti-Christian guy is the pastor of that church, and the church is growing. It's like the New Testament, isn't it? A Saul-Paul story, but God did amazing things. But we'd prayed, and God didn't seem to answer. And sometimes we have to wait for the right time. But God's timing is perfect, and he chose that particular time, I believe, to work in that particular family, because if God can change the heart of somebody so anti-Christian, anti-Christ, then surely he is powerful and he can do amazing things. And learning to trust in God's timing is something we find difficult. When we pray, we want God to answer now, don't we? Or yesterday, if possible, because it's important to us. But we have to trust that God's timing is perfect. During COVID, I was in Lamjung on my own and really wanting to get stuck in to train our teachers and visit the schools. And of course, all the schools were closed. And that was frustrating, but I had to learn to wait on God's perfect timing. You might remember that I've been working on some books, some phonics books, textbooks for teachers to use, and the publisher had promised that they would be ready in March this year for the schools to use in the new school year, and they weren't ready. And so our teachers were saying, we'd promised the books to them, where are the books? And I didn't know. I tried to contact the publisher, and he didn't answer my phone calls or my emails. So it was really frustrating. What is happening? Why are these books not ready? But I had to trust that God's timing was perfect. Just before I left Nepal, I had a few weeks in Kathmandu, and I was able to meet with the publisher. I don't know what the delay was, but he phoned me up and asked if we could talk about publishing them for the next year. And more importantly, the relationship that I have with the publisher has been restored, and so now we can speak to each other and we understand each other better. So God's timing is perfect. Next slide, please. For the last 4 years, I've been living and working in Basi Sahar in the district of Lamjung. It's very beautiful, as you can see. We can see the mountains. It's also very hot and very wet. That's the road in the middle to one of our schools. I was wishing I'd got my wellies on my boots that day. And so all of our schools are on top of the hill, and so walking there presents quite a challenge, and that's me looking very hot and tired, having crossed one of the swing bridges to get to one of our schools. There's not many foreigners there. In fact, during COVID, I was the only white person in town, which led to quite a few conversations and lots of friendships, actually, that started during that time. So it's not an easy place to live, but God had prepared me well. Because I could speak the language, because I knew the culture, because I love the food, I could integrate into that culture and that community very easily. And so when difficult things happen in the community needs each other and they support each other. And I felt very supported by my neighbors, by my teachers, and by the church, and able to support them too. I felt very much a part of that community. And many times over the last few years, I've come to realize that God had not only prepared me to live and to thrive in that community, but he had a reason and a purpose for me to be there at that particular time. Can we see the next one, please? During COVID, a neighbor's son, Ayush, here he is, had online classes. Not many schools had online classes, but his school did. And his family couldn't afford Wi-Fi, so he came to study on my porch every day. He came at 6 o'clock in the morning, so I had to be up and about and gave him a glass of milk and a banana to eat. But I got to know him really well. He was there for most of the morning, studying every single day, except Saturday. And he loved to bake. He loved to make cakes. His favorite was banana and chocolate cake, and, of course, to eat them as well. And he and his little brother call me Auntie, and their young mum, Sushma, became a very good friend of mine. One day, they came back from church to find that Ayush's father had disappeared. He'd packed all his things and left with no contact, no possibility of getting in touch. They had huge debts and no money to pay for food, let alone school fees. So in an instant, their stable life had disappeared and they'd lost hope for the future. Ayush thought he'd have to leave school. He'd just completed grade 7, thought he'd have to leave school because they couldn't pay the fees, and he thought he would need to work to earn some money for the family. Normally in Nepal at such times, family members would come to help him. They would get help and support from other members of their family. But since they became a Christian, their family has refused to speak to them. So there was no hope of getting help from their family. So what options do they have? You know, here there would be support, wouldn't there, from the government or from the local community. But what options did they have? How would they survive? Next picture, please. And because I'd built such a relationship with them over the years, I was able to go alongside them. They lived just over the road from me, and together we talked, we cried, we prayed, and eventually we worked out a solution that would keep the boys in school. The youngest son was just 2 at the time, but he had to start school early to playgroup, which is still quite a formal education, not ideal for a 2-year-old to go into that situation. But it meant that Sushma, the mum, had time to do a little bit of work. And she can sew. She's a tailor. And so she's managed to find work, which she takes to her house, and she sews garments for people and earns a little bit of money that way. There's even the possibility that they might make some money selling the cakes that they learnt to make in my kitchen. So for such a time as this, next picture, please. When I arrived in Lamjung, I decided to visit all of the 7 churches in town. And on my first Saturday, I went to this church. It was much smaller then. There were about 25 believers, 20 believers maybe. But I felt so welcome and so at home in that church that I decided to stay. And the church had just got a new pastor. That's him in the neon t-shirt. He's not a quiet, shy person, isn't our Pastor Isaac? But he has a real understanding of how to disciple new believers and how to encourage people from a Hindu background to love and follow Jesus. And he has a vision to lead a church of over 200 members. That's quite a big vision from 25 believers. But we're now seeing that this is beginning to happen. Roger told me today that since you heard about my church in a video recently, last year I think, he's been praying for that church every day. And I'm so grateful to tell you that your prayers are being answered, because very recently we had 12 people, new believers, baptized and welcomed into church membership. And so slowly that vision of 200 is coming to pass. One of our young people has just completed his theological training, and he will come to work in the church as the 2nd pastor, which is great. But such a vision has practical implications. The church was too small, it was built next to a river, and it was prone to flooding. And so part of the reason I think I was there was that I was able to channel some funds from BMS, from my church in Scotland, and from individuals to that church to help the needy, but also to help to build the church. And the pastor and the young people actually physically built these buildings and the wall in the river to stop the flooding. And so now we have this outdoor kitchen that you can see and a meeting area. And it's been such a blessing to the church that we can all meet together to celebrate different events. That was actually my leaving day, leaving celebration there. And we've got a kitchen, so we cook. Food plays a big part in our church celebrations. And it's been such a privilege to be part of that vibrant fellowship and support those believers. To support the pastor really by listening and reflecting with him and by praying about his vision and the next steps. And the pastor and his family and those believers have become my family, really, and made living in Basie Sahar so much easier for such a time as this. Next, please. My work with KISK EQUIP stands for Education Quality Improvement Programme, and it involves providing training and support to teachers in 3 projects, but because I was based in Basie Sahar, I was working with teachers in 15 partner schools in Lamjung. Most of my colleagues live in Kathmandu, and they travel out to do training and follow-up in the project 3 or 4 times a year. My training has been focused on training for nursery children, for grade teaching, and for problem solving, like I told you, but also on phonics, because phonics is my passion. But I think that apart from the training, my main contribution to the work of EQUIP has simply been to be available in the schools to hear of the needs of the teachers and the students, and to help us in EQUIP to work out how we can help to support our teachers to provide the best education. You might remember of the time that our students in one of the hostels were so cold that they couldn't sleep at night, and so they couldn't study well the next day. And one of the students said, if I had brought the blanket, my family would be cold at home. So they only had one blanket. So when I heard of this need, when on one of my school visits, I asked our friends in Kathmandu if anyone had a spare blanket. And the next week they sent 52, I think it was 52 blankets. So every student in the hostel had 2 blankets, so they were pretty cozy, and they were able to study for their exams really well. All the amazing time we were able to set up 3 IT labs in our schools with donations from BMS. But as I visited the schools, I could see these lovely computer labs with 10 or 20 computers, but realized that the teachers actually weren't confident in using them for themselves, let alone teaching the students. And so when we realized that that was a problem, we found an organization in Kathmandu that was training students, a college, and they were willing to send their students out for a month to live in our schools as like an internship to provide training and teaching to our students and the teachers. And after that month, the teachers were much more confident in using computers. And you've heard too about the feeding program and the difference that that has made to many of our students. So being there to hear of these difficulties meant that we could then help, we could respond to the difficulties for such a time as this. Next picture, please. This is one of my favorite pictures. They say that a picture says 1,000 words. Just tell me, what do you see in that picture? Tell me what you see. Smiles. Sorry? Yep. No shoes, eh? Bare feet. Sorry? Flat road, yeah. Stony road. Anything else? Yeah, they've got backpacks. Great. Good job. Yep. But no school uniform. The clothes are a bit dirty, a bit shabby. But anyway, let me tell you the story. I'd been visiting one of our schools, and as I was leaving and coming home, I met these 2 children on the way. And I got talking to them, and they told me that they were walking home to a village that I knew was 40 minutes walk away. And they were on their own. That wouldn't happen here, would it, in Britain? But it was quite common. It's quite common that children would walk home. But 40, and for them maybe 50 minutes walk to go home. But they told me that, yes, they like school because the teachers are very kind and they get to play with toys in the nursery class. They were in the nursery, which is why they were leaving a little bit earlier than the rest of the students. And we in Equip had provided toys for our nursery classes, so they were being used, and they liked that. But the best thing about school was the school lunch. Seeing that they had no shoes or school uniform. Oh, and they also told me that that day the bank had given them a backpack, a free backpack. So all of the nursery children were given a backpack to take to school. And I asked them to show me what was in it, and it was empty, totally empty. So the next time I went to the school, I spoke to one of the teachers, and I asked them about these two children. I know he's very passionate about helping all students to get a good education. And he told me that these students are from the Chepang community, which is a low caste, a bit like Dalits, you might have heard of, a low caste community. Traditionally, they were nomadic people, so they moved around, but this community had settled in a village 40 minutes away from the school. And traditionally, they wouldn't send their children to school, but once they heard that there was food available in school, they've started sending their children. And so now there are 18 Chepang students in this school. So whatever the reason that they come to school, we're delighted that they're now getting an education. But the teacher went on, it's so difficult because they don't have pencils, they don't have notebooks, they don't have textbooks. How can we teach them? And it's maybe not so important in nursery school, but there are some older children too, and they really need to have those resources. So hearing of that, I was able to speak to my colleagues in Kathmandu, and we've provided 3 scholarships in that school for Chepang children. Although it's only 3, it's actually 3 families that are benefiting from that, so it's more of the children are getting help to go to school. And the next time I went, I took pencils and notebooks and gave them to the teacher so he could hand them out when there were students who didn't have them. So I was in the right place at the right time. If I hadn't met those children on the path, I wouldn't have known of that particular need, and we couldn't have helped. Next, please. Equip has been working in Nepal for over 15 years now, and we've now needed a time of reflection to make sure that what we do is as effective as possible. These are some of my colleagues in Kathmandu that I work with, and it's been a really good time for me to be part of the organization as we've reflected on what we've done in the past and how to move forward. The government's brought in a new curriculum which is more child-centered, which is very alien to our teachers who are used to teaching by rote and repetition. And we've been able to consider how we can make our training more effective, and even when we leave, how the initiatives and the training that we've provided will continue. The project in Lamjung, where I live, will finish next year, and so we've decided to identify champions in our schools, those teachers who really get it and really want to make a difference and can be local leaders in their school and community and can encourage other teachers to continue in the new teaching methods too. Because change is difficult, isn't it? And we found that when we give training to our teachers, for example, when I do phonics training, the teachers all come to the centre and we spend 2 or 3 days learning about phonics, and they get very excited about teaching children to read in English using phonics. But then they go back to their school and it's very different and very difficult. So the next week, if I go back to the school, they will say, oh, this is too difficult. We want to teach phonics, but it's not on the timetable. We don't know when to teach it. And we need all the other teachers in school to know about phonics too, because if I teach through phonics and then they go to the next teacher the next year, they won't understand how they're reading. And the parents think we're crazy if we teach phonics and their kids come home saying but instead of ABC. They think they're going crazy. So we need the parents to understand, and we need some more resources. So when we heard that, we can then do something about it. So we've started parent seminars. We've started whole school teacher training so that every teacher has a little introduction to phonics. We've taught the parents about how we teach, and we've provided resources. So we've realized that having teachers who are based in the project, like I was in Lamjung, is really important. Being in the right place at the right time. Next, please. Let me tell you about 2 of the people that I've worked with closely in Equip, Krishna and Santona. Krishna is the head of training program, and he and Dil are BMS supported partner workers, so their salary is paid for by BMS. And if in the future you wanted to continue your link with BMS, you could, and with Equip Nepal, you could support Krishna or Dil instead of supporting me. Next, please. Don't think it's mine. Santona is the English teacher trainer in Equip, and she's very passionate about including everybody and including girls in education. And although she'd been an English teacher for a long time, she'd never heard of phonics. And I'd never heard of phonics either until I came back to the UK in '96, and Jolly Phonics had become a big thing to be taught, and I had to learn very quickly how to use it in my primary 1 class in Scotland. But I realized that it would really help all my students to read, and that also it could be used in Nepal if somebody had the time to rewrite it so that Nepali students would understand according to their context. And so in lockdown, when I couldn't visit schools, I had the time to do just that. Next, please. And Santona was a great help in making sure that the stories in the book would be easily understood by Nepali children. She became really interested in phonics, and together we have worked on trainings and school follow-ups together. You can see she's pretty strong here. She's carrying a box of resources to one of our schools. So I know that she is able and committed to continue to train and support teachers in phonics in our school classrooms. But isn't God's provision amazing to bring us both together at the same place to work on the phonics program together? And that leads me to the next point, my last point. What of the future? For me, as I leave Nepal, how can I say for such a time as this? When is the right time to move on? How do you know when it's time to leave? There's always more that could be done. And perhaps it would have been good for me to stay until the project ends next year. And I'm not sure what the future will look like. I don't know what God has called me to. Perhaps I'll be able to continue to support the work of Equip from UK. I'm still writing some books and some resources that can be used by my colleagues and in our schools. In February, there's going to be a big celebration of all our work in Lamjung Project, a closing ceremony, and I'd really like to be there for that, to see the teachers again and to be there as part of that celebration. Maybe that will happen. But I've handed over everything that I was working on to my colleagues, and I know that it's in capable hands. Nirajan, who's the science teacher, has even taken on the nursery teachers training. He was trained in secondary science, so it's not his gifting, but bless him, he's taken it on and he will do a good job. But we really need someone with experience in early years who can train our nursery teachers. But I know that the work of Equip will continue and will flourish because it's in good hands. But more satisfying is knowing that it's in God's hands and that He will make it happen, because God's timing is perfect. He prepares us and then He places us in a certain time and a certain place for His purposes. And then sometimes He asks us to leave. We may not know what the future holds, but God does for such a time as this. Just have a few prayer points that perhaps you could think about, and just pray for the work of Equip to continue. We don't only work in Lamjung, we work in other projects around the country. Pray for the work in Lamjung, that we would complete all that we have to do, but that the teachers would continue to work through the schools and that our work would not be halted. Pray for me as I transition to live back in the UK. I don't know what retirement will look like, so I've got a lot to learn. And pray for all of us that we may choose to be part of God's plan wherever He calls us in the time that He gives us. Thank you.